I'd like to thank our sponsors, Donahue Fitzgerald, the Contra Costa Times, Minuteman Press, and all of you that donate to the Walnut Creek Library Foundation. Our programs are free, but as you know, a free public library does not operate on public funds alone, so we appreciate all of your help. I'm very excited to introduce two gentlemen tonight that are great friends of the Walnut Creek Library. In fact, TJ Stiles on his Facebook page today said that we have a great library here, and I have to agree with him. TJ grew up in Foley, Minnesota. He attended Carleton College and did his graduate work at Columbia. He's the author of 3 biographies of 3 men who were all greatly impacted by the American Civil War in very different ways. Jesse James, last rebel of the Civil War, won the New York Times, was mentioned as a New York Times notable book. The London Times named it one of the 5 best biographies of the year, and it was a finalist for the book prize in biography by the Los Angeles Times. The first Tycoon, the epic life of Cornelius Vanderbilt, won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. His most recent book was published just a few weeks ago, Custer's Trials, A Life on the Frontier of a New America, and it has already been selected by Amazon as one of the 100 best books of 2015 and one of the 20 best works of history for this year. Our host this evening is Pete Crooks. Pete is senior editor of Diablo magazine and author of the book The Setup, which is now in production for a major motion picture. Pete grew up here in Walnut Creek and has told me several times that he spent many happy hours in our old library, which was formerly on this site. And now someone has written a note at the bottom of my notes that says, please silence your cell phones. Pete and TJ.
I did.
I think I did. What a treat, and thanks to the Walnut Creek Library Foundation for hosting events like this. I'm of the opinion that a new TJ Stiles biography should be met with the kind of excitement that most people find for the new Taylor Swift album. I'm glad that there is such a great turnout of book lovers. We're in for a really interesting conversation. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too. You should go on tour with me when I talk about the book. I like that attitude.
Speaking of tours, I was looking at your Facebook page today and I saw more rapt audiences, huge turnouts at recent appearances in Kansas City and St. Louis, was it?
Yeah, I'm no Stacy Schiff, but in Kansas City and Missouri and in St. Louis, there was an audience of people who've been familiar with my work because, of course, Jesse James had a big impact when it came out, and his life story is so centered there. So that was a great week. Last week was terrific. But I'm going back on the road after this tomorrow to Minneapolis and Denver and Miami. So.
And speaking of Minneapolis, that's where you hail from originally, the Minnesota area?
Yeah, I grew up actually not even in a small town, outside of a small town of about 1,000. I grew up about a mile from a town of 1,000 people, north of Minneapolis, about 90 miles. My parents are originally from the Chicago area, and my mother's always been furious with my father for finding the only small town in Minnesota that had no lake. That means it was a really funny joke.
Favorite Bob Dylan song?
Mm-hmm. Me?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I knew somebody in Minnesota when I was in college whose mother had babysat Bobby Zimmerman, so Bob Dylan, yeah.
She must have had some good stories.
Small state.
So before writing the Jesse James book, you worked as an editor for the Oxford Press?
No, actually not as an editor. I really had a strange kind of winding path to come back to what I was always interested in doing, because I'd always loved history. I mean, I was a little kid, my parents joke about how I was in 3rd grade and we had to do a report for schools, like a page long, and I was going to write the history of World War II, and I thought that was way too much, so I limited myself to the war in the Pacific for my 1-page report. So it's just something that I've always loved history, and I've always loved books. I've always loved writing, and so I went from going to graduate school for history, and then for a lot of reasons, I finished my coursework, but the academic path was not for me, and ejecting out of it and landing partially by accident, actually largely by accident, at Oxford University Press. But what I did is I was a copywriter, so I was writing the catalog and jacket flap copy, and it was in trade books, which means general interest books. The term in publishing for general interest means is trade, but it was all serious nonfiction. So I said I've often said that it was like being paid to be a graduate student. I mean, paid about what a graduate student would be paid, but I was reading manuscripts, I was writing up short essays on them, and then I was calling up the author and talking to them about it. And, I made some, I learned so much there. I learned about writing. I had a boss who had an MFA, and, I got to know people in publishing. And I got immersed in the other side of it also. By working in publishing, I was interested, that's all about the book itself. It's about writing, it's about the success of a narrative, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And so I had this training as a scholar, and yet, I went to work professionally in a world that was about writing and about the book. And that's something that when I finally got to writing my own stuff, I tried to bring together.
And that's something when I talk to the interns that we have at Diablo magazine, when they're fact-checking or doing some rudimentary tasks that are important to get the magazine published, that they can really learn so much by reading what different writers, just observing the styles that different writers use. So it does seem that those experiences, though not as exciting as winning a Pulitzer Prize, must have been hugely impressive at that stage of your career.
Yeah, and here's an example. One of the people I dedicate the book to is Richard Maxwell Brown, who passed away right as I was finishing up the manuscript. I was going to send it off to him. And he was one of the great and really groundbreaking historians of violence in American history. He was the primary author of the commission report, the Congressional Commission in 1968, after the assassinations of that year. He did a report trying to explain violence in American history and the historical background to this. It was a very big deal at the time. And I worked on one of his books, writing the catalog and jacket flap copy, and I was so impressed because it was about legal doctrine of self-defense, and it tied it into the history of violence in the American West. And he took seriously all of these high-profile episodes that we now mostly know through entertainment. And it's the sort of thing that most, academic scholars, they've just got a gut instinct to dismiss anything that's a part of popular culture or to study it only as a popular cultural artifact. And he took them seriously as episodes of history and looked at how they reflected all of the tensions in the American West. And I was just fascinated. It was taking famous episodes, dramatic episodes, and showing that they're more significant, not less. And he was a great writer and he's incredibly generous. And so when I came back to working on my first book, Jesse James, I reached out to him. He read the proposal. He later read the manuscript. He really helped me to get publishers to take it seriously. So it's both the influence of reading and being exposed to what people are doing, and then also the personal contacts. I mean, it's amazing how generous people are. And so, I try to do that as best I can to help people, who are coming up, who are coming out with their first books, or even friends who are established scholars, but they need a favor. I've gotten plenty of favors. I try to pay them back.
Now, on the subject of famous American assassinations, isn't there a story about a great grandparent of yours and a wristwatch of Abraham Lincoln? Or
this
pocket watch?
Yeah, this happened actually. This was an old family story that I was very surprised to suddenly see the stories about it in the Washington Post, because a cousin of mine followed up this old family story. And my grandfather used to sit around, my father's father used to sit around and tell about how his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, was fixing Lincoln's watch when Fort Sumter was fired upon, and how he left this inspiring inscription inside the works. He described it on the back of the dial. You know, the first shot is fired, slavery is dead, thank God we have a government, and closed it up and gave it back to Lincoln. And so his name was Jonathan Dillon, Dillon. And Dillon is also, because of that, is my father's middle name, and we gave it to my son as his first name. And so I love that story, and I thought, well, I can always repeat it, but no one's going to open up Lincoln's watch to check. But they actually did. And it's because at the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, the Smithsonian had a huge exhibit, and I have a cousin who is a skillful and passionate genealogist who was interested in it because of that story my grandfather used to tell, and who my father gave him a copy of a letter my grandfather tried to follow up with the Dillons of Ireland. He was from an old watchmaking family and watch repair family. And so he did all the research about what kind of watches Lincoln had. He found a story in the New York Times where my great-great-grandfather was interviewed by the New York Times like in 1905. And it was about how he was the oldest juror in New York history. And he said, no, let me tell you a really interesting story. I was fixing Lincoln's watch when Fort Sumter was fired on. And he actually convinced this guy who came out of the blue, convinced the Smithsonian to open up the watch. You know, it was, and they were so worried that it would be like Al Capone's vault, you know, just be nothing in it. And there actually was an inscription signed Jonathan Dillon. He didn't actually predict the death of slavery, but it was a cryptic little, you know, patriotic passage. And so, you know, all through the Civil War, you know, Lincoln was carrying around a watch with a little inscription from my patriotic inscription without even knowing it from my great-great-grandfather.
What a treat that at the bicentennial anniversary, you're able to fact check that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know.
Speaking of tales of your family and intersections with American history, apparently your father likes to tell stories about his relationship to one of the Jesse James gang.
Yeah, that's right. There was a new member of the James gang in 1876 who was supposed to be the local guide. He was from Minnesota, to guide the gang to Northfield, where they were famously, the gang was basically wiped out. The only survivors who were not captured were Frank and Jesse James. And his name was Bill Stiles, and he was shot dead. And you know, the towns, back when my father went to Carleton College in Northfield, as well as today, you know, they had postcards, because, you know, whenever somebody got shot, they would immediately, you know, the local photographer would take souvenir photos of the corpse. And so he's got a bullet hole in his chest, and he looks a lot like my father. And so my father, you know, used to show me this postcard and say, yeah, he's a relative of ours. And you know, it's, if he's a relative, you know, it was in England in 1500s, because my family was in the Northeast at the time. But it's, you know, I love that story, and the fact that he actually looked like my father convinced me for a long time.
And was that the inspiration for writing that book?
No, it wasn't. No, I actually had to work against that kind of thing, because, you know, like in my mind it was all, you know, some cutesy thing that was, I kind of was dismissive of it. And actually I had to kind of overcome my own tendency to kind of be dismissive of it because it was so familiar. It was a little jokey part of family lore. Mm-hmm. So
let's start with the James biography and talk a bit about the process that you undergo while researching a topic. First of all, the James book came out in 2002.
That's right.
And the first Tycoon 7 years later, and now 6 years after that. So it's an incredible amount of work and a big chunk of your life that is dedicated to researching and writing these books. I'm fascinated by the three subjects that you've picked, and I'd love to discover how you decided to focus on each of them. Starting with James, because as you mentioned on your bio on your website, much of James' history is through word of mouth and mythology, and he lived sort of in the underground, so there isn't as much public record on James as the latter two subjects. So starting with James, how did that subject materialize into a book?
Well, this is interesting in another way too, because it touches on something that runs through all three books. I'm kind of gotten more interested in the intertextuality of my books, people and themes and even places and events that appear in all three books. And I was very interested in writing about the Civil War and Reconstruction as one continuous story. And there's been more and more, not only serious history, but also more popular history about Reconstruction that's beginning to work its way into the public consciousness in a way that was less true when I wrote that book. The birth of civil rights, the birth of the idea of human equality regardless of race and ethnicity. This is a part of the great revolution that took place as a result of the Civil War. And so, but it was a result of the Civil War. So the war in Reconstruction and political fights that we still have today to some extent all come out of this amazing period. And yet a lot of people are interested in the Civil War, Appomattox, and then we're done. In fact, that was just the opening act of part 2. So I wanted to write about that and get at those issues. And I originally thought to write about a man who was very much at the forefront of the best of that period. And his name was Adelbert Ames. And he was somebody who incidentally was a class ahead of Custer. He actually co-hosted parties at West Point with Custer, at West Point I should say. And he went on to become a Boyd general like Custer. He was a few years older, but he got promoted to be brigadier general during the Civil War when he's in his 20s, served very well. And he was deployed to the South after the Civil War and to Mississippi and really took up the cause of the emancipated slaves, of the freed people. And it wasn't just political maneuvering, it wasn't personal gain. In fact, a very hostile Jim Crow era history of Reconstruction in Mississippi, published in like 1905, said that even Adelbert Ames's political opponents agreed that he was an honest, forthright man. His great error was that he overestimated the mental capacity of the black race. So, even his opponents agreed that he was motivated by high ideals, they just didn't agree with those ideals. And he became a senator and then a governor of Mississippi during a period when what was then a black majority state had black voters, in which the government had mixed white and black legislators and office holders. A really noble guy, frankly. But nobody's heard of him. And my friend Ethan Waters, who's a great San Francisco writer, says that when you're a writer, nonfiction writer, a good way to start is to write about what you don't know about what you know. And I think that also works as a formula for writing for the general public. You tell them what they don't know about what they know. And if you start with someone they don't know, then you've got to have some other way to get their attention. Like, maybe, when I'm 90 years old and actually a household name, maybe people will buy a book about Adelbert Ames. But I'm not there yet, and I certainly wasn't there at the beginning of my career. But then I realized, he was robbed by Jesse James at Northfield in 1876. And as I started to dig into it, I came to the conclusion that Jesse James actually targeted Ames because he had recently been this very progressive, racially egalitarian governor of Mississippi. And I thought, I can tell the same story from the side from somebody that people do know. And it's a dramatic story. I love, people who are in the physical danger, that have this physical drama. I think that's fun storytelling, but it's got to be about something big. And so I actually kind of backed into it from the other side. So since I like Ames, and just simply because he's one of those people who's everywhere, he keeps showing up here and there in both my other two books, especially with Custer, because he was a contemporary and Custer knew him. So that's how I kind of backed into it. It was the questions, it was the interest. And then I got into the person. I thought, who is somebody I can write about that has a good story, but tells this gets at the themes and the questions that I'm interested in. And then, from there to Vanderbilt, when I was asking questions like, why rob a train? Well, it turns out it's actually a very complicated question. It has to do with the structure of the national bank system that was created during the Civil War, about the way that banks throughout the country had to deposit reserve balances in New York at New York banks, and then they drew down those deposits. So there's a seasonal flow of currency, and it turns out Jesse James, this country boy bandit, was really smart about robbing trains moving the right way, and how the whole economic system is tied into what this bandit is doing. And so that led me into the rise of the corporate economy and the birth of the financial system. And again, I looked for I had the question, and I went to looked for a dramatic figure who hadn't been overwritten about. And the reason no one had written about Vanderbilt is no one hated himself enough to try, because he didn't save any papers. He burned every letter he read as soon as he read it. And yet there was so much material, and I just kept finding more and more stuff. And so by the end, I was like, this may be the last time I can write a biography, or it'll make my career, one or the other. So I had to push it as far as I could. And then the question was, okay, I've written about, the Civil War through Jesse James. I've written about the rise of the corporate economy, et cetera. But there was still more about this amazing era in which modern America comes into being. And Custer was someone whose life is like a travelogue through that amazing panorama of an America that's got Sitting Bull over here, and it's got Cornelius Vanderbilt in New York. And it's got slavery and the death of slavery and the birth of civil rights in the South, and it's got the rise of Chicago. And it's just amazing panorama, and Custer's crossing back and forth, doing so many things that have to do with the new America, but so volatile and such a good story that I thought, oh, this is a good person to write about. I can get at the period, but tell stories I haven't told before.
I want to get to Custer, but while I'm thinking on the topic of your research, I always like to talk to authors about how important libraries are in their lives as readers and book lovers, but also as places to do work. And I know that the New York Public Library was critically important in the Vanderbilt book.
Oh yes, yeah. It was actually important in material as well as research, as in terms of research. The New York Public Library is a great research library. Public libraries are incredibly important. I mean, I've done all kinds of research, just through the public library. If through the interlibrary loan system, for example, you can go to your local public library and you can have access to the holdings of a huge network of academic libraries, university libraries, and you can check them out and take them home. Even on the Custer book, I looked at microfilm from the Library of Congress that I didn't get to when I was in Washington, of the George B. McClellan papers, the important Union General. And San Francisco Public Library, I was living in San Francisco, they get on interlibrary loan, looked at it there. So libraries are so important, and it's not just the research libraries, but the New York Public Library is a great manuscript holding library as well. And I was living in New York on the Vanderbilt book, while working on the Vanderbilt book. And of course I went to other places, including the National Archives and Library of Congress. But all of the executive, the sort of corporate headquarters papers, like the minutes of the board and other correspondence of the New York Central Railroad, are at the New York Public Library in the manuscript room. And so I was working on the Vanderbilt book and frankly running out of money. And I applied for a fellowship because they also have a Center for Scholars and Writers, the Dorothy and Lewis Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. And they have a physical space. They have a mix of fiction writers and nonfiction scholars and writers, sometimes playwrights and poets. And you have office space, you get a stipend, and I managed to get this fellowship right when I was literally running out of money. And who was I working next to? The office next to mine was Colin McCann, the great novelist, who's a friend, Nathan Englander, Jennifer Egan, San Francisco native who won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, a great biographer, Hermione Lee, who was working on a biography of Edith Wharton. We had really interesting conversations. So, the combination of community and research access, and then in that case, frankly, money, it was hugely important. It really allowed me to finish that book. and do it as I in the best way I could. So that was an amazing experience. That was incredible.
And that book is released in 2009, just as the economy is diving into a crater. And you mentioned on your bio that you really didn't know if your future would be as a professional writer.
I mean, the orders from bookstores were about half of what they had hoped for when we moved toward publication right before the financial crash. I mean, I was thinking, it's all over. I was thinking it was all over, and I didn't know what I would do. I mean, it was a really rough time, and I just written my heart out. I'd done so much work. I thought so hard, and just the economy was just wiped out. And usually we think of publishing as being books as being somewhat recession-proof. Man, not in 08 and 09, and then, I was saved by the National Book Award when it comes with a $10,000 prize, and you've got a lousy business model when it depends upon you winning the National Book Award. And what's interesting is that, still, it was only when I won the Pulitzer when I really got, speaking engagements and things like that. So even then it was still uphill, not uphill, but, it was still... it took another prize before I started to really see some accessory financial benefits, which are just, frankly, if you're a full-time writer, it's a tough living. It's really hard to make a living, and that was hugely helpful. And it delayed this book, and yet, I'm incredibly grateful. I love to be able to go out and speak to readers, and not every author likes that part of it so much. I do. But, in that case, it really helped keep me afloat also, which was really nice.
Well, it's so fascinating to, have the peripheral experience of hearing what it's like to win those awards. Can you walk us through how does the National Book Award, how is it distributed, and then the Pulitzer as well?
Yeah, the National Book Award is not as famous as the Pulitzer, but for nonfiction, it's actually harder to get. And the character of the two awards is very different. And I wouldn't pit one as being more or less, but it's interesting how they work. The National Book Award, there's a foundation which was originally created by publishers, and it's an independent foundation that promotes literacy and reading and literature. And so they only hand out 4 prizes, fiction, nonfiction, so all of nonfiction is grouped together, juvenile literature and poetry. And they pick a jury of often recommended, by previous juries. It's a mix of people, 5 jurors, I think it is, in each category. Now they've got a long list. So there's 10 books that are on the long list, and they narrow it down to the finalists, the 5 finalists. And then those juries meet the day of the award ceremony to pick the winners. So there's no leaking, right? And sometimes they meet for lunch, and sometimes, like 5 minutes before the ceremony, they all walk in with finally they've got a winner. And it's arbitrary, and I think that part of the point of award ceremonies like that, awards, is the very fact that we all realize it's arbitrary once they pick someone, and we start arguing about what other great books there are. I think that's one of the best benefits of it, is when people disagree with the choice. Because it's ridiculous to pick one book in any category, let alone all of nonfiction. So it sure didn't feel ridiculous. It felt great when I got it. But so then it's the closest thing they have to a real glamorous event in publishing. There's a big black tie dinner. They have somebody hopefully funny who's the MC. They give out a couple of other awards. Dave Eggers actually got an award for his contributions to literature the year I won. And you're sitting at a table, because it's a dinner, black tie. I bought a tux, still the only tux I've ever owned. And you're sitting there with people from your publisher, my agent, my wife was there. And right before I won was the worst moment in my writing life, because I looked around at them, and they're announcing the finalists and describing the books. And I thought, all these people are here for me. I am going to let all of them down. They're not going to know what to say. They're going to be awkward. It's going to be terrible. I'm going to disappoint all these people. And I just felt awful, like I was totally fine to not win before that, but then I realized they were all going to be sad, and I felt awful. And then I won, and I have this wonderful editor who's just generous and a great guy. But when he talks about the writing, it's all like, what can we do to make this book better? It's like, it's not a vanity project, it's about the work. So he's real like tough-minded when it comes to the writing. And so when they announced my name, he hopped up, he bear hugged me and wouldn't let me go. And and then the next thing he said was, "Aren't you glad I made you cut out all that material about Nicaragua?" Yes. Yes, I'm glad. Yes, you were right.
Did Vanderbilt have issues of self-doubt like that in his career?
Never. No, that was one reason why it was fun to write about Custer, because Vanderbilt was this like force of nature. He was always just like this fascinating guy, but it was hard to find the contradictions in him. Whereas Custer, just speaking as a writer, was just amazingly volatile character. It was really fun to write about. So anyway, but the Pulitzer is just totally different. They have a jury that picks finalists, and then there's a standing Pulitzer board. Membership rotates, but it's journalists and scholars and writers, and they read all the finalists in all the categories and pick the winners. And so often the Pulitzer winners are less surprising, because you don't just have 5 people who are making their choices. I think the difference between the two awards is actually really useful. The Pulitzer ones are more likely to be ones ones that speak to a broader audience. They aren't necessarily, it's a broader pool of people who are looking at these books, and it's broken down by category, nonfiction and other categories. So there's a biography prize, there's other general nonfiction, there's other categories. So the Pulitzer is better known, but it's broken up. There's actually more Pulitzers that are handed out in letters. So technically, instead of there being one prize in nonfiction, there's maybe 4 or something. So, easier to get. But I think they're both actually it's useful to have both of those, I think. And then, so they announce it, and they just announced the winners and finalists, and it's a big news conference. And so I had strapped my son I'd picked up my son, who was 2 then, from daycare, buckled him into his car seat. He fell sound asleep. My editor called on my cell phone. I was like, yay! My son was unimpressed. He slept through the whole thing. But it was just this random, it just descends out of the blue on the day they announce. And then you go a month later and they have just this luncheon, business attire luncheon, and hand out the little square of paper that, says you've won the Pulitzer. So interestingly, ceremonially, it was just a much more lower key event.
Mm-hmm. And at that time that you received those awards, you've started the Custer.
Yeah, actually, I was struggling with a proposal which I got increasingly felt like it just wouldn't reach a big enough audience. And then my editor liked the idea, and he kept pushing me to work on it. And finally, when I finished the proposal, sure enough, the marketing people in-house said, there have been other books on the subject that just haven't done well. And we could buy it, but we couldn't pay him enough to make it worth his while. That was what I took from it. So I went back, I said, what am I? I'm a biographer. This was a book about the 14th Amendment and civil liberties, and it was much more of a general history book. So I said, okay, what do I like doing, and what's my market advantage, and what am I known for? I'm a biographer. I like biography. I like telling life stories, and then having the chance to bring in the history, which was such a necessity with Jesse James, because there's such little information about him personally. To tell his story, you have to make it about the history. It's necessary. With Vanderbilt, there was a lot of personal material I found, but it's still about big questions. And I thought, okay, whose life story can I tell, but what can I do differently as a writer as well as a historian? And that led me to Custer. Even though he's been written about so much, he's just such a well-documented and vivid character. And unlike Vanderbilt, though I was able to do it more than with Jesse James, there were still limitations on how far inside his head, that interior state, was still a little bit opaque, or it was frustratingly consistent. Whereas with Custer, he just expressed himself so immediately. He's so vibrant and volatile and contradictory, in his letters and what people wrote about him, that you don't have to like him for him to just be an utterly fascinating character. And just as a writer, it was so much fun writing about this, It was like writing about, thanks to Breaking Bad, I can explain my take on Custer, because Walter White, like, he's a pretty, he's an anti-hero. He's a guy who's out selling incredibly addictive meth, and yet he's gripping, like he's creating disasters for himself and digging his way out, and that's basically Custer's story. It was surprising to me actually how many personal strengths he had, and in trying to make sure he was a vivid person, I would write about just the awful things he would do to his wife, or with his political views, and then I would say, okay, I have to keep alive, why his wife loved him, or why he was able to save himself from this latest disaster, and bring back his strengths, and talk about what made him a three-dimensional person, because he did have this amazing ability to alienate everybody around him, but then he would save himself. So you don't have to like him for it just to be a great story, I think.
And the subtitle, A Life on the Frontier of a New America, you have a really fascinating thesis that he was a man living on the frontier of time. Can you explain, both he and his wife, can you give a more detailed description of what you mean by that?
Yeah, and this goes to how I got into Custer as a subject. Like I said, we all know him for that one thing, how he died. And because of popular culture, really, I think probably due to the movie Little Big Man more than anything, he's just reviled. And people who've never read a word about Custer have incredibly strong opinions about him. He was a murderer and a rapist and, all this other stuff. And frankly, there's good reasons why people hate him, because he symbolizes to people some of the most destructive and disturbing parts of American history. Now, in trying to separate out his personal culpability in some of those episodes, people can think that I'm rehabilitating him, but I'm not. But I in fact, I understand why people get so upset about him, because he represents huge crimes and huge problems on a historical scale, and they're personalized in him. So yeah, people are upset about him. But when you look at what his life was actually like, it's just this astonishingly crowded life that included large, episodes and long periods in the West. But most of his life was lived elsewhere and was involved with very different questions. And he was a divisive figure in his own lifetime, and yet the way people divided over him initially has nothing to do with what we remember him for. So, as I said, I came in and here was Custer moving back and forth with his wife, back and forth across this amazing panorama of America, from the Great Plains to Manhattan and literally to Wall Street, at the stock exchange. Going south and helping to destroy slavery and dealing with its aftermath, all these things. And when I thought about what was he doing on all those travels, this is a guy who in countless ways was engaging or trying to engage in a completely new country that's emerging out of the ashes of the Civil War. And yet he never could adapt to it personally. He was always, many Americans were like Custer. They had similar views, they had similar ambivalence and inability to adapt to this new world. But but at the same time, Custer was unable to adapt. He was unsuccessful. Sometimes he really wanted to, sometimes he resisted the new world. So in these huge changes America is going through, for example, the old personal world of personal relationships, individual proprietorships, is being displaced by the giant corporation. And that comes into being during his lifetime. Those personal credit and personal business relationships is now being overshadowed by financial markets. And what does Custer do? Later in his life, he goes to Wall Street. He spends 2 years, all told, in New York. And he tries to launch a silver mine, by floating, not by attending to the business of the mine, but by trying to float shares on Wall Street. And, just trying to, build up a bubble and sell out at the right time. He later gets involved in the stock market personally, and he's a gambling addict, by the way. He becomes a gambling addict. And at a certain point, I think he promises his wife he won't play cards anymore. So what does he do? He goes to Wall Street and he starts gambling. He leaves her with a gigantic debt that she finds out about when the broker shows up with a bill after his death. This is a guy who, he's destroying slavery in a very important relationship. And he has a wife who he marries, and they have a passionate, complicated, volatile relationship. She's well educated. She represents, the American woman of the future, even though she still accepts the social mores of the mores of the older era. She resents the restrictions placed upon her, and yet she can't bring herself to violate them. So he has a wife who represents what women are going through. And then he hires as his cook, when he's a general for the duration of the Civil War, this young escaped slave who uses her position in his household to try to educate Custer about slavery and also to build her own authority. This is a woman who's never had any personal security, who's always been subject to the whims of white people who technically owned her. And now she actually she trades information. She dispenses food to her own patronage network. And she adroitly keeps Libby Custer, the woman who's supposed to be in charge of the house, out. Very adroitly. And their relationship is fascinating. So, the way in which the larger changes in America are reflected in his own household are so interesting. And then you get to Custer dealing with, and this is where he becomes very controversial. He goes from being an authentic hero in the Civil War, someone who he maneuvered for promotion, he's working those old chains of patronage, and yet when he has a chance to shine, he shows that he has real merit. And this volatile guy who's trying to escape this obscure background, who wants to be great, who wants people to think he's great, he's insecure, he's brittle, and yet the one thing he's always comfortable with himself at is fighting. And of course that's what we think he's terrible at, because he died fighting. And yet that's, up until that last moment in his life, it's what saves him from himself over and over again. People get fed up with Custer because he's so volatile, he's so bad at managing, but leading on the battlefield, that he's good at. But then he goes, from the moment the Civil War ends, he starts to create these crises for himself. And it begins with Reconstruction. He's opposed to the first Civil Rights Act. He's opposed to the 14th Amendment, the basis of civil liberties and civil rights. He campaigns publicly as a serving regular Army officer. He campaigns with President Andrew Johnson, who's totally opposed to the new civil rights acts that the Republican Congress is trying to pass. And Americans who saw him as a hero begin to split, and it has nothing to do with the West. It's over race and Civil War loyalties and the attitudes toward the new America that's emerging from this. And so, he's kind of embarrassed. He's kind of dug himself into a hole. Johnson, gets him from a black regiment where he was assigned to a white one. Custer says, "Thank you so much." And he goes out, and he's got, this crisis continues. He gets court-martialed in his first campaign against the Cheyennes and Lakotas. And he has to come back from it. And he comes back from it with a battle against the Plains Indians, that he conducts, the operations he conducts very well, but it sees scenes of terrible bloodshed, in which he's basically ordered to carry out an atrocity, and he does. So he's often accused of killing women and children. He carried out an attack that did kill women and children, but he tried to stop it. But he knew it would happen. And he actually shows that it could be avoided later on in the same campaign. But he's ordered to bring back no fighting age males alive, and he doesn't. And in the Civil War, the Army would have considered that an atrocity. They probably would have tried an officer who'd done that. In the West, it's just normal. And I try to point out that Custer does bear some moral culpability. He himself showed that these things could be avoided, ironically, in a later episode. And yet, the most disturbing thing about Custer is how normal he was in that setting. And so, that's what's really terrible. There are other battles that are not well known that have similar death tallies of women and children and men. This is the way the Army operated. It attacked population centers to get control of these Native Americans and push them onto reservations. So Custer's embroiled in that, and even these episodes in the West are tied to what's going on in America. The Transcontinental Railroad. He's defending it in print as well as out in the field. He's using his new fame in the West to launch himself into a writing career in the new national media. I mean, he's trying to engage in all these different ways of the new world. And yet, for example, you look at his writing style, it's an outdated antebellum writing style. At a time when Henry Adams is starting to write, when Mark Twain is writing, when Ambrose Bierce is writing, people who come out of the Civil War with a much more cynical, realistic worldview, and Custer comes out of the Civil War with his romanticism intact. And so, it's just, when you look at his life as a whole, what we know him for is important, and it's a big part of the book, but it fits into this whole about Custer that shows why he was controversial for reasons that we don't even remember now, and that also speak to things that we still fight about to this day. I mean, I think Custer is incredibly relevant, as well as just being this astonishingly fascinating character who's just, constantly looking, I say you never saw a frying pan without immediately making for the fire. And so, it's revealing, but it's just a fascinating story for me, at least.
And a very strong example of your theory to tell the reader what they don't know about what they already know.
What they know, yeah, exactly.
Couple of real quick questions. You mentioned Little Big Man, and many of the characters that you've written about have been the subject of Hollywood mythology. I had a chance to interview the singer Roseanne Cash recently, and I asked her what she thought of the Johnny Cash movie that came out a few years ago, Walk the Line. And she kind of sighed and said, that she loved his autobiography, Cash by Johnny Cash, but you just can't get his life and the family life into a 2-hour movie. So it sounded like she was thumbs down on what was pretty widely regarded as won Academy Awards, and it was a big hit. So I wonder what your thoughts are when you go to see a movie or when you review a movie like Little Big Man, or the Andrew Dominic movie, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford.
Well, that's actually, to me, that is by far the best movie about Jesse James. It's based on the Ron Hansen novel, which I love, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. And it was made into this very lyrical, very sort of literary movie that could have easily lost half an hour. We saw the director's cut and we didn't need to. And yet, what was interesting about why it was so good and so accurate about Jesse James is that it narrowed the scope. Instead of trying to be a biopic, it narrowed it down to, it was mainly about Jesse James and his relationship with his killer. And there's a few other characters like his brother Frank and some other people who are involved in the story, but it's very tight. For example, Jesse James at the end of his life lived very close to his old homestead he'd grown up on. And his mother was this towering figure. I mean, literally towering. She was 6 feet tall at a time when most men weren't 6 feet tall. She was outspoken and fierce. This is someone who, the family was banned from Missouri during the Civil War because of their support of the guerrilla insurrection there. And I read the Provost Marshal's report to justify their being expelled from the state. And it said, of the boys, Frank and Jesse James are Confederate guerrillas and terrorists, frankly. And it said of his mother, she is the worst woman in this state. It was after some horrible atrocity in which they killed about 100 men and, just murdered all these prisoners. Somebody had challenged her and said, aren't you ashamed of what they've done? She said, I'm proud of them and I pray to God to protect them in their work. And yet she's missing from that movie entirely. Mm. And, you start to look at what's missing and you realize how it works because they narrowed the scope. And there's very little they can get wrong because they've cut out so much. Mm-hmm. They tighten it and it becomes very much a personal portrait. And Brad Pitt captured that ability of Jesse James to switch from charisma to incredibly menacing in a moment. Jesse James was charming and funny, and yet, late in life, he went to the St. Joseph, Missouri Railroad Depot to apply for work. He said he'd had a lot of experience in train work. He was funny. And he was a mass murdering, slave-owning racist also. And, of the dozen or so men we know he killed or suspect he killed after the Civil War, all but like one were unarmed, and many of them were tied up when he killed them. So, this is somebody who was funny and charismatic and just ruthless and deadly. And Brad Pitt captured that mercurial quality so well. But it's very hard to find a movie that does that selects the slice they're going to tell and then really gets it right. And it's difficult.
I thought that was a beautiful movie.
Yeah.
Visually beautiful movie.
Absolutely.
So I've got one more question, and then we'll open up to audience questions. We are sitting here in late 2015 celebrating your wonderful book on Custer. If we were to return in 2021, 2022, what might the next book by T.J. Stiles be?
Well, same thing, one of the interesting things to me in this book came from a moment when I was reading President Grant's first inaugural address. And, President Grant is often seen as a weak president who tolerated corruption. Actually, he was very much an idealist, and he comes off pretty well in my book. And he and Custer clashed a lot. They were very much opposite personalities and had opposite political views. And so it's interesting that that Grant, who especially in his first term did so much to really promote civil rights, he says, and any steps, I forget the exact words, but basically any steps to make the American Indian a citizen and civilize him, basically he'll support. And he carries out the Quaker policy of appointing Christian missionaries as Indian agents. So this comes from the same point of view that is driving ahead this great and positive revolution of civil rights. But when you apply it to people who have traditional group rights, autonomy, traditionally defined autonomous nations, essentially sovereign nations within U.S. borders, it's incredibly destructive. And that's really alarming because intuitively we think of the fate of Native Americans and African Americans as being kind of the same story, and it's not. And so I decided to write a book about, and I have to approach it with a lot of humility because I'm crossing a cultural boundary, about Chief Joseph, who was the Nez Perce leader, who he and his band were one of the last bands to be forced onto a reservation. Actually, the old reservation had included their ancestral lands, and they're being forced off their ancestral lands to a new, smaller reservation. And they fled to Canada. The general who started that war was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau and founded Howard University, the first black university. And so it's not that he was the intellectual leader of civil rights, but he's a player in it. It's an organic way of telling Chief Joseph's story, but integrating it into this great conundrum of that era and some of the troubling questions about how some of our best ideals also played a role in some of our worst historical doings. And then it also allows me to carry through that story of survival as Chief Joseph, this guy who lived in one of the most remote bands of Native Americans. He's got to go to Washington and lobby Congress to get his people back to the Northwest. He's basically presenting his argument in the press. He's going to the White House. He had to discover this new world and reinvent himself. So that's what I'm grappling with in the next book.
That should be fascinating. So raise your hand.
Someone we can actually admire at the center of the book, right?
So you're talking about Chief Joseph, so I wondered if you must have read Dying Grass, William Goldman's book?
I actually haven't read it yet, but yeah, it's on my reading list, obviously, yeah.
It's such I tried to read it, I'm like working on it, but it's like about 9,000 pages.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that's Wade Bowman writes these amazing, historical novels, and it is gigantic.
Yeah.
And so, right now I'm still taking notes from other people's endnotes, and I'm going to work my way there. Okay. But, I also have a complicated relationship with fiction and with film because I don't want to be overly influenced by fictional portraits, that I worry about that. And, frankly, with Jesse James and with Custer, I just made a point of, I'd seen some stuff, but it had been a while, and so just made a point of staying away from it. So Volman's work I'll get to, but that's actually kind of down my list because I don't want to be overly influenced by his view. But he's a massive researcher as well as a writer. So
I've been asked to repeat the questions after they're asked. So
oh yes, it's a good point.
So it's on film.
Oh, it's on film?
No, we're videotaping it. So you asked the question, I'm going to repeat the question.
I have two questions. The first one, did I understand you to say that after the Civil War in Mississippi that the blacks had the vote? And did they hold an office?
She asked if you have to buy my book, and yes, you do. No, I'm sorry.
So my question is, when did they lose all that?
Yes. this is actually a good, just plain factual question. Where she was asked about how African Americans in Mississippi after the Civil War got the vote and how long that lasted. What happened is that for a couple of years after the Civil War, there was this kind of cyclical process where a political conflict kind of drove ahead civil rights even farther than people envisioned when the war ended. So Lincoln, at his last speech, the one at which Booth swore that he would, that he would kill Lincoln after it, he called for enfranchising, giving the vote to African Americans who were military veterans and possibly those who were literate. And so that was kind of, an idea that he was kind of broaching and that people were talking about, limited enfranchisement of those who showed that they were capable of being citizens. But what happened is that this cycle very quickly accelerated the whole conflict, because if freed slaves themselves drove ahead this big political crisis. They literally had conventions. They formed union leagues in the South, where they had political meetings. They were starting to form schools at a time when the South, under Lincoln's conservative successor, Andrew Johnson, they had laws basically requiring the freed people to work for their old masters. And they had vagrancy laws that basically enforced the old travel restrictions. And so by demanding real freedom, they met with a brutal backlash by former Confederate soldiers. And then the North said, wait a minute, the only loyal people in the South are the freed slaves. Even people who were racist said, in the North said, well, wait a minute, we can't let the former rebels, brutalize the people who stood with the Union, African Americans. And so it pushed ahead this political crisis that resulted in the first Civil Rights Act, the 14th Amendment, which basically was an attempt in part to not only guarantee some basic civil rights, but also to kind of force the South to enfranchise African Americans. And then finally, the 15th Amendment. The Reconstruction Acts required 10 of the 11 Confederate states to pass new constitutions, state constitutions, that enfranchised African Americans. So there were, I think there were 4 states that were black majority: Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. And that was very strongly true in Mississippi and South Carolina. So in those states, you had a lot of black office holders. And in Mississippi, you had the provisional military governor, was Adelbert Ames, who started to appoint black office holders and who sided with the Republicans, who were the racially progressive party at the time, and actually resigned from the army to be a politician. As he put it, I had a mission with a large M to serve in the interests of African Americans. And he wasn't just condescending. In his case, it wasn't just a political thing. He worked with black leaders. There were grassroots black leaders who came out of Mississippi. There were even black senators from Mississippi. But what happened is that there was a backlash, largely violent. So in Mississippi, the state government was overthrown by force in 1875. The Democratic Party reformed itself. So this is about 8 years of Reconstruction. We actually had black voting. And then you had essentially a revolution, an armed revolution, that the federal government refused to put down. And then you still had federal intervention to maintain, black participation governments in Louisiana and South Carolina. But by 1876, those are basically the only states that still have, black voting and black office holders. And then as a part of the deal that allowed Hayes to become the Republican president, he agreed that they would stop enforcing civil rights in these few pockets where they were still doing it.
So it didn't last very long then.
It was a very brief period, and it was a very promising period. I mean, this is why the civil rights movement came back, is because we put into the Constitution these things. The first Civil Rights Act is still on the books. The Ku Klux Klan Act, in which Custer was deployed to Kentucky to help put down the Ku Klux Klan. And he didn't want anything to do with it because he sympathized with the very people he'd fought against in the Civil War, after the war. And yet his troops are being deployed to arrest Klansmen and try them, and they're carrying out murders, etc. This is an amazing period, and people used to think of it as a period when, oh, it was a bunch of carpetbaggers. Now, historians, for a while now, have really saw this. The tragedy of Reconstruction is that it didn't last longer, and that it really could have created a different America had it continued, potentially. So.
There was a gentleman in the back that.
Yeah. In the Jesse James book, he talked about a newspaper reporter who was sort of a publicist for the Southern general who invaded Missouri toward the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
And afterward, I think, was working for a newspaper in St. Louis and wrote a column about when the James came train robberies,
Mm-hmm.
the chivalry of crime, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What became of that?
He's asked about this key player in the Jesse James story named John Newman Edwards. And he was a Confederate cavalryman who was the adjutant to the most famous Confederate general from Missouri, which was a divided state. It officially sided with the North, but it was also a slaveholding South that had a strong cohort of secessionists. So Jesse James was a part of the secessionist minority. So John Newman Edwards and his general, Joe Shelby, rather than surrender, they actually went to Mexico for a couple of years after the Civil War. They refused to surrender. And they came back in 1867, and he actually launched a whole project to get the Confederates back into power in Missouri by taking over the Democratic Party. So you could have a minority, but if they were a majority in that a party that could then, get control of the state, the majority, that majority of that party could then rule, or at least the strong minority. And he tried to convince Missourians they were a Southern state. He was this. So Jesse James surfaced in 1869 in a failed attempt to kill the guy who had killed a notorious Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War. He carried out a bank robbery and killed somebody. That brought him to the attention of this guy, and they formed an alliance. And Jesse James carried out robberies, and he wrote letters to Edwards newspapers, and Edwards wrote these editorials, The Chivalry of Crime being one, in which he used Jesse James as a way of, and Jesse James, I think, was a willing participant, to galvanize the Democrats, or the Confederates, to convince people that Missouri was suffering under the Republican, boot, and contributed to kind of, by Jesse James's death, a majority of the congressmen from Missouri, which had been a Union state, were former Confederates. So, they won. But Jesse James didn't. He died. Anyway, John Newman Edwards, he went on. He had he edited another newspaper later, suffered terribly from alcoholism. I believe he died an early death. I would have to go back and revisit that material. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Without Jesse James, and like Jesse James, once their political victory was won, he was sort of a man without purpose. And I believe he may have died of alcoholism.
Talking about Jesse James, I had a kind of an eerie experience about him. I grew up in Missouri with an A, in Kansas City area, and me and a buddy, 7 years old, and we had the James gang. That's all we heard. We're going to be the James gang. So when I bought your book, I sent him a copy of the story of Jesse James. And then when I visited back there a while ago, I live here, I saw that Jesse James was going to have a grave marker. So we went out to the town. My dad went to school there at William Jewell Bible College, because his dad was a preacher. And I said, let's go out there, see your school, and see this Jesse James thing. We drove out there. You couldn't find out where it was. Where's the grave? I thought, this is a major attraction. They didn't have anything there. I went to the bank that Jesse James robbed. My dad went to a drugstore that he knew from back when. And I came back and said, well, where's this Jesse James stuff? And we finally found the grave. And my dad says, I was talking to a guy about Jesse James and where's the grave? And this guy said, look, mister, we don't like Jesse James around here. We don't talk about Jesse James. And my dad was stunned. I was too when I heard this. I'm just thinking like a little kid still,
Yeah.
They don't like Jesse James. He said, he killed some people here, and we don't forget that. And he run this bank, which I'd just been at. I thought, ooh.
Well, if you went next door, you might meet some people who felt completely differently about it. I mean, the funny thing is about Kansas City is a city that arose after the Civil War, really, as a city, as a great cattle butchering and processing city, but along the Missouri River Valley, you have an older, slaveholding area. So if you go to Clay County, north of Kansas City, you're in the south. You go south of the Missouri River to Kansas City, and you're in the north or the Midwest. I mean, it's really interesting. They still grow tobacco in parts of Missouri. So it's still to this day, I mean, as seen in Missouri versus Missouri, though that doesn't track exactly, it's still a state with divided identities. And so people do feel very differently. I remember I had a radio interview when Jesse James came out with a Missouri radio station. And they said, now, Jesse James is still remembered in Northfield, right? I said, yeah, they have a festival every year, the Defeat of Jesse James Days. The defeat! The defeat! They're celebrating his defeat? They was very upset about it. So there's still a lot of loyalists in Missouri.
Now, speaking of buying books, you're going to be signing in the back, and I can't think of a better first edition to get than this one, all the hard work that went into writing it to get a personalized autograph on it. So we'll take one more question I see in the very back in the cowl hat, and then we'll make sure we have plenty of time for Mr. Stiles to sign books. And by purchasing the book, you're also supporting Rakestraw Books, one of our great indie bookstores here in the East Bay. So.
Right here.
Wondering about General Crook. You're going to write the thing, the sequel to Custer about General Crook, who's charged in
Yeah, he just asked a question about General Crook, and there's so many interesting people that keep popping up over and over again. The Union Army during the Civil War, grows gigantic size. I mean, if you look at North and South, millions of men serve, and so after the war, it shrinks and it keeps shrinking and shrinking, which is part of the tension of Custer's life. His life is no longer about battle; it's about managing in these units in which nobody gets promoted ever. And, these personal relationships get really close and bitter. And so certain people, they're there all through his life, even if he doesn't deal with them. General Crook is one. He was someone who played a very key role in the Shenandoah Valley, where Custer actually really becomes a superstar celebrity, even though he's just a division commander. And he plays a key role in helping Sheridan. Some would say it was up to Crook to win a couple of battles, including 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Creek. And what happens is, after the Civil War, he's deployed out west. This guy, again, most people don't know about. And he has 2 fields in which he fights. One is in the southwest against the Apaches. And there he becomes a very creative, culturally sensitive general. He relies very heavily upon Apaches, recruits to fight the Apaches who are raiding and whatnot. These are people who have lived among the Spanish and then become the Mexicans, and then later, Hispanic Americans. And so, they're even when they're on the reservation, there's still a culture, a raiding culture, and Crook's got to deal with this. Very creative and inventive guy. But then he's deployed to the Northern Plains, and there he has real trouble. And so he's a key player in the death of Crazy Horse, for example, et cetera. And one of the things that's a key part of the book, the Little Bighorn, it's very important to know about my book, it gives me a chance to say this, is that I wrote it about his life. So I deal with the Little Bighorn substantively, but it's like 15, I don't even think it's 20 pages in the epilogue, which is more than any other battle gets, far more, but it's way less than it ever gets in any book about Custer. So much has been written about it, I didn't need to write another study of the battle. But I try to give you the experience of what Americans had. This terrible thing happens, and knowing enough about it. And one of the things that Custer did not know as he approached the Little Bighorn, that even his native scouts didn't know, who were so good at reading the signs, who knew their enemy, because they were from enemies of the Sioux and the Cheyennes, is that Crook had advanced in this multi-pronged attack to try to bring the Lakotas and Cheyennes, force them onto the reservation. Crook had come from the south a few days earlier with a column, and that the Lakotas had actually ridden out and attacked his column. And in the Battle of the Rosebud, it was a day-long head-to-head fight of the sort of battle you just didn't see in the Indian Wars. And it was tactically inconclusive and strategically a big victory. Crook is forced to retreat. So here they are, Custer advanced on this village. It's far more Indians than they ever expected to face. Right before he left, Sheridan had sent a telegram to his commander, Custer's commander, General Terry, saying, I only hope they stay together long enough so that you can attack them in one big battle, because what a short time period they can stay together in a body. There's no sense that there's way too many for Custer to deal with. And he doesn't know also that they've won this big victory, and it's also, he doesn't know that it's right after Sitting Bull's had this vision in a Sundance the Indians are confident, they're in huge numbers, they have at the peak of their fighting skill and their power as a nation, and they're incredibly confident, and they have great leadership. So as I point out in the book, that in the attempt to kind of distance ourselves from the dispossession and conquest of Native Americans, people despise Custer. He bears the weight of that. And one of the ways people try to despise Custer is by suggesting he was a terrible general. In fact, that was the one thing he was good at. And I think if we diminish that victory by saying Custer was an arrogant idiot, we diminish the magnitude of that victory. That was an amazing accomplishment. I mean, they didn't beat a piker. They beat a guy who'd spent probably more time in tactical combat than any other American officer. It was a guy who'd won battle after battle after battle after battle, who'd been in incredibly tight situations and gotten out of it. They beat the best the American Army had to offer. And so you don't have to like Custer. And believe me, a lot of other officers in the Army hated Custer, and yet they said, you know what, but he can fight. And so you don't have to, you can hate him, I don't care, but you just have to acknowledge the facts. And the fact is he was good at fighting, and they beat him. And they beat him fair and square, and they did it through their own merits, not because Custer was an idiot. And that's very important to remember.
Let's round of applause for our wonderful guests. Books are for sale in the lobby, and thank you so much for a fascinating evening. This just flew by.
Thank you.